Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. There has hitherto been no greater event than this struggle, this question, this contradiction. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in philosophy. From each I've selected an excerpt, 30-40 minutes, no more than an hour, from a classic work that is a classic for good reason. Our purpose is to have an introduction to an important work, and we'll do a close reading with the accompanying text. In this episode, we're turning to Friedrich Nietzsche and his 1887 book on the Genealogy of Morals, in which Nietzsche is diagnosing in part what he perceives to be a decline into a nihilism in the European cultural context, his diagnosis and hopefully some inspirational rejuvenation of a positive alternative. Let's go to the text. Let's start with the title on the Genealogy of Morals, and I've highlighted genealogy, which is Nietzsche's way of signaling, a way of thinking about morality that's not traditional. Often we've learned to think of morality as a series of absolutes that came down from on high and that they have held for all time, and they will hold for all time. Nietzsche is suggesting that more like a family tree or a series of family trees, they evolve and change over time, and that there are different, of course, family trees, each with their own constitutional factors. But that's reading a lot into the title. He also indicates that this book is meant to be read as a sequel to his previous book, published the year before, Beyond Good and Evil. This is a follow-up book, but it's organized quite differently. Beyond Good and Evil was a series of books of mostly aphorisms, and one had to do a great deal of effort intentionally on Nietzsche's part to unpack a lot of the aphorisms and connect earlier aphorisms with later aphorisms. The idea of Genealogy of Morals is to be more structured, and the work is organized into 3 more systematic essays. And today we're going to look just at the first essay, although I do want to signal a couple of things from his preface. And he starts speaking somewhat autobiographically here in this third section in the preface, where he says, "Fortunately, I learned early to separate theological prejudice from moral prejudice, and ceased to look for the origin of evil behind the world." So that's already an interesting distinction for many traditionally minded people for whom morality and theology are pretty close to being one and the same thing. But what Nietzsche is then suggesting is that moral prejudices do not necessarily, and in his view, they do not actually come from allegedly theological sources. We don't have to go behind the world or beyond the world or above the world in order to find where these moral prejudgments come from. From his own perspective, a certain amount of historical and philological schooling, as speaking that he is trained as a historian, particularly as a historian of languages. And he loved languages, and his PhD work actually was in philology. And when he was appointed professor at the University of Basel, it was as professor of philology. So what he's arguing is that his special training in languages has put him on to something about the genealogy of morals, as has his historical training. Together, though, with another element here, an inborn fastidiousness of taste in respect to psychological questions in general. And this is interesting, a suggestion here that morality and one's taste are going to be largely matters of one's psychology. And with that, a suggestion that different kinds of psychologies are going to have different kinds of tastes and perhaps then different kinds of moralities. And so the question that he then puts himself is not, what theological source should we look to for our morals, but rather a much more naturalistically, historically, and language-based investigation. So here's his question. Under what conditions did man devise value judgments, these value judgments, good and evil? And what value do they themselves possess? And those are striking questions. That then is to say that if we are looking for where morals come from, is to say that Man devises them. We make them. We might just make them up in some cases, but more likely what we have is that men are in certain conditions, certain historical conditions, existential conditions, and it's because of those conditions that they devise certain value judgments about what's good, bad, right, wrong, important, unimportant, and so forth. But then also there's this interesting second question that is tacked on, that instead of taking judgments about good and evil and the standards or the principles as in somehow not to be questioned, what we should precisely be doing is to take of any claim about right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil, and to ask, well, what value does such a judgment have? Of what use is such a principle? And then a value standard that he himself is suggesting, we can then say of any given moral code, has it helped human beings or has it possibly hindered them? Have they hitherto hindered or furthered human prosperity? Are they signs of distress, of impoverishment, of the degeneration of life? And it's interesting to say that in some sense, a moral code might be a sign of a kind of impoverishment or a sign of distress, a way of externalizing something negative and problematic that's going on inside the human beings who have devised them. Or is what is revealed in them, on the contrary, the plenitude, the force, the will of life, its courage, certainty, and future. Okay, so some provocative remarks off the bat. He then singles out what he takes to be a prevalent and worrisomely prevalent moral code, a moral code that takes for granted, more or less, that egoism is bad, that it's wrong to be selfish, to be self-interested, and so forth, and that the opposite of that, the unegoistic, the instinct of pity, feeling sorry for people, self-abnegation, being willing to lessen oneself, to bear privations, self-sacrifice, which Schopenhauer had gilded. It's important that he's indicating Arthur Schopenhauer, who was extraordinarily influential on Nietzsche's early thinking, which Schopenhauer had gilded these unegoistic virtues, the great German philosopher, and projected into a being for so long that at last they became for him value in itself. So he's saying that for Schopenhauer, or by the time we get to Schopenhauer, if we take Schopenhauer as the culmination of a certain kind of moral tradition, we are no longer even thinking about values as instrumental, as coming from some condition of the world, as supposing to be used for furthering human prosperity or expression of human prosperity. Instead, they're just values in themselves, and to be taken as intrinsically what we should be believing. And then because of that, he has so deeply gone down this road that the unegoistic is so deep and axiomatic almost for him, that on the basis of which he said no to life and to himself. So what we have then is, if we take what has become the prominent moral code Nietzsche seems to be suggesting, and learning this from Schopenhauer, we end up in a kind of nihilism, as he suggests at the end of this paragraph, a will to nothingness, a desire for total self-abnegation, total self-denial, total elimination of the self. And that's another provocative question in the preface here. Jumping down to the sixth section of the preface. So on the basis of this, he wants to then say, let us articulate this new demand. We need a critique of moral values. That is to say, we need to put moral values on the block and investigate them scientifically, rationalistically, by whatever tools we have at our disposal. But the point is, we're not going to just take whatever our parents and preachers and politicians and cultural leaders say as the good as axiomatic. The value of these values themselves must first be called into question. And then this genealogy theme again. And for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew, under which they evolved and changed. One has taken the value of these values as given, as factual, as beyond all question. One has hitherto even doubted or hesitated in the slightest degree of supposing the good man to be of greater value than the evil man. So yeah, evil people do certain things, good people do certain things, and we're supposed to just automatically say whatever is involved in being an evil man, well, that's just of lesser value than but why? But we need to think about this, the question then is going to be. And this very provocative, what if the reverse were true? What if a symptom of regression were inherent in the good? It's likewise a danger, a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, etc., etc. And if so, if we have all bought into a certain kind of moral code to the point where we don't even question it, but if it is in fact a moral code that does not enable us to live the best way possible as human beings, instead it's a slow poison acting on our psyches and thereby on the rest of our lives, then we would have a bad morality. And then we would be able to say, as Nietzsche puts it here in the form of a question, precisely morality would be to blame if the highest power and splendor actually possible to man was never in fact attained. Maybe morality, or at least what we've commonly thought of as morality, is a danger, and in fact, the danger of dangers. Now, another suggestion from the preface, he's referring to a colleague of his and friend, Dr. Paul Ray, and suggesting that he had not read Darwin, or if he had not read Darwin deeply enough or considered the implications of Darwin. And it is worth pointing out that Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. At that point, Nietzsche was a teenager, but a very bright young teenager, and what we have then is the first generation of moral philosophers, as well as, of course, people from many disciplines working through the implications of Darwin's biological theory of evolution for everything else. And what we find in Nietzsche is in the generation subsequent to the publication of that book, we're now, 28 years later, so basically one generation, where Nietzsche, and also Nietzsche himself is now fully mature at the height of his intellectual powers, reflecting on and absorbing into his own understanding of morality, the implications of evolutionary theory. All right, with those prefatory remarks, at least my excerpts, just a few of them, we turn formally to the first essay, Good and Evil and Good and Bad. And they are put in quotation marks by Nietzsche. That's significant, and also they are distinguished from each other. Why is there both good and evil and good and bad? All right, now what he does, interestingly, is go on the attack against a group of thinkers he calls the English psychologists. And I expect in this context he has people like Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, perhaps, all who were writing in the previous generation to Nietzsche. And what they have developed is a certain understanding of morality, but also they are attentive to history and the development of morals as well. But what he does is he doesn't call them moral philosophers, he calls them psychologists. And it's interesting that Nietzsche is saying that they are delving into morality and moral psychology, but they are revealing something deep about their own psychology in the doing so, and they are interesting human beings. But then he goes on to insult them in quite a number of ways. If we jump down to this second paragraph here, but I am told they are simply old, cold, and tedious frogs, creeping around men and into men as if in their own proper element, that is, in a swamp. So something very distasteful from Nietzsche's perspective about this way of doing moral philosophy and psychology. And what he's finding in their morality is something that seems to be more worthy of seeing human beings as swamp dwellers, and morality as a projection of the kind of being that swamp creatures would do so. And so Nietzsche, jumping back to this first paragraph, I said, well, why is this the case? What is really that always drives these psychologists in this direction, this kind of dehumanizing or belittling human beings? Is it a secret, malicious, vulgar, and perhaps self-deceiving instinct for belittling men. Okay, so an interestingly insulting couple of paragraphs, but why so? What's Nietzsche find so objectionable about them? In the second section of this first essay, he then goes on and gives a brief description of the kind of moral theory that they come up with. So they start by saying, okay, the unegoistic, or perhaps the other regarding, or perhaps the altruistic and self-sacrificial mode of behavior. That's what it is to be a good person, an ideal person. And to the extent that you are unegoistic in that direction, you're a good person. To the extent, by contrast, that you are an egoistic person, you are a bad person. And then we have the question, well, how did we come up with this division of people into good and bad along this unegoistic to egoistic spectrum? And then Nietzsche says here, well, the way they have bungled their genealogy comes to light from the very beginning, where the task is to investigate the origin of the concept and the judgment good. All right, originally, so they decree, one approved unegoistic actions and called them good from the point of view of those to whom they were done. Okay, so we will pause there. So I'm a person, I do an unegoistic action for someone else, and it's that other person who is doing the labeling and saying, oh, that is a good thing that you have done. And somehow I then accept their labeling of my action and I take their value framework. That is to say, those to whom they were useful. And so it's a matter of usefulness. And now we know clearly that Nietzsche has the utilitarians in mind. Later, one forgot how this approval originated. Oh, it's just lost in the mists of time. And simply because unegoistic actions were always habitually praised as good, one also felt them to be good as if they were good in themselves. Okay, so that's the kind of explanation. Nietzsche's giving a cartoon version of this explanation. But notice the key words that I've highlighted, and they're, of course, the ones that Nietzsche goes on to highlight. What kind of person, when coming up with a theory, thinks naturally in terms of these as the prominent feature? It's what other people think. It's their labeling, it's their standards, and I'm going to accept their standards. And that we are concerned with what's useful, with what's prudent, with what's practical. That we are forgetful beings, and we do things habitually. We're just creatures of habit, and we're doing all of this because other people are praising certain things, and so we just more or less accept what other people are doing so. And so what we then have is a forgetful, habitual being who is concerned only with praise and lets other people set the terms for evaluation of goodness. And Nietzsche says that's repulsive. And he then goes on to explain a different way of looking at things. Now, it is plain to me, first of all, that in this theory, the source of the concept of good has been sought and established in the wrong place. The judgment good did not originate with those to whom goodness was shown. Rather, it was the good themselves. That is to say, the noble, powerful, high-stationed, high-minded who felt and established themselves and their actions as good. That is of the first rank. Now I'm going to pause right there for a moment. That is to say that morality, right, and the concept of good first comes from the self, and it's going to be the self of a certain kind of person, where I feel something to be good, and I want to express that in my deeds, and so I go ahead and do it. And because it came from me, and I did it, and I like the result, I judge it to be good. What other people think about that, well, we'll get to that a little bit later, but that's not the important thing right now. And I know myself, and I'm discovering, and I know why I feel the way that I do, and I'm doing whatever it is that I do. And then by contrast, if we're going to have a duality between the good and the bad is going to be anything that is not like me. And so, if there is something that is rather low and plebeian and the way common and so forth, all of that's alien to me, I'm going to label that as bad. And I am going to assert the right to impose my own standards on the world, not to have other people's standards and just accept them more or less passively. So it is a power that I am asserting, this right to label things as good or bad. Now, interestingly, he also says, it is out of this pathos of distance that they, that is to say the high-minded and more strong types of people, first seized the right to create values and to coin names for these values. What had they to do with utility? That's interesting. The suggestion seems to be, I'm not so much concerned with how useful things are in the world as I am with putting my label on, making my mark on the word, and on the world rather, and in part by means of the words or the coining, right, of names, by establishing my standards on the world. Okay, so jumping down then, it follows from this origin that the word good was definitely not linked from the first and by necessity to unegoistic actions, as the superstition of these genealogists of morality would have it. Rather, it was only when aristocratic value judgments declined that this whole antithesis, egoistic, unegoistic, obtruded itself more and more on the human conscience. It is, to speak in my own language, the herd instinct that through this antithesis at last gets its word in. All right, so that's going to be a later development. So first we have people who are strong, powerful, self-assertive, and we call them more aristocratic, perhaps with good reason, because that is the kind of person who is more likely to be powerful in his or her own life, but then also in social action. They are the ones who are going to determine the courses of action, impose their way upon the world, including the value framework, right, upon the world. And if we now have a very different value framework, it must be that it came from a different sort of person, the herd type of person who somehow, this is still to be explained, came to ascendancy and was then later able to impose its own value framework on the world. Now, next section, Nietzsche talks about language, philosophy of language, and his training as a philologist. The signpost to the right road for me was the question, what was the real etymological, and etymological means origins of words, significance of the designations for good coined in the various languages? And so the idea here is we go and we look at all of the great languages, and we look at all of the great ancient languages, and we see how those languages evolve over time. So if we go way back in the earliest great languages, the ones that we have records of, and we look at the moral vocabulary that they have developed, I found that they all led back to the same conceptual transformation, that everywhere noble, aristocratic in the social sense is the basic concept from which good in the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble, with a soul of a higher order, with a privileged soul necessarily developed. So if we go, the claim is, and look at these ancient languages, the good is always identified with the type of person who is an aristocratic type of person, the kind of soul that person has, the kind of actions that that kind of person has. And we have at least a stereotypical initial understanding of what it is to be an aristocratic person. You think well of yourself and you want to assert yourself upon the world. That seems very different, in fact, the exact opposite from being unegoistic. It is a kind of egoism. And a development which always runs parallel with that other in which common, plebeian, low are finally transformed into the concept bad. So the good is identified with the aristocratic, the bad is identified with the low, the common, and the plebeian. So he gives some examples, the first of which is German. Take the German word bad, schlecht, and then he notices that if we do some kind of word association here. The word schlicht, schlechtweg, schlechterdings. Right? So simply, plainly, bad, plain. So all of those words form a concept cluster, and they're all on the negative, ordinary side of things. And they are in distinction to all of the kinds of words that we would use for noble and aristocratic types of people. So in the next section, he gives some other examples from Greek, from Latin, even from Gaelic. If we take, for example, the word kakos in Greek, well, the word kakos means bad, but it's also ugly, ill-born, mean, craven. So that is to say, that kind of person is assigned the bad. And another negative word, the delos, cowardly, worthless, vile, wretched, the plebeian, in contradistinction to the agathos, the Greek word for the good, but also well-born, gentle, brave, capable. All right, so what we then have is in ancient Greek, this distinction between the good being associated with the more aristocratic and the bad being associated with the more common and plebeian. Find a similar thing in Latin, similar thing in Gaelic. He gives some examples there, and then jumping down here, the Latin word bonus, which is a word for good, in contemporary English, something that's a bonus, it's a good thing, it's an extra. But the warrior, and then he makes some connection here. Bonus is traced back to an earlier word, duonis, and then bellum. Right? We in French and in many of the Romance languages have the concept of a belle, which is a beautiful thing. But then the origin here seems to be tied to the word for war. So the kind of person who goes to war, and war is beautiful, and that of course is the powerful aristocratic type of person as well. And then an interesting other suggestion, connecting the German word for good, gut, right, close to the word for God or the godlike, and then also the Goths, so making a possible connection there, that the Goths gave themselves a certain kind of label. We are the special people, and they are a people who prize power, warlikeness, and so on. Okay, so some linguistic things forming evidence for this idea that in ancient history, the moral vocabulary was not about unegoism and selflessness and being nice to your neighbors and so forth, that rather the opposite of that. It was egoism captured in a certain kind of lifestyle, a noble, aristocratic, warrior type of lifestyle. That is the origin of the languages of good. So how does this transformation then happen? And what he does then argue is that, of course, in the old days we had common people and then we had more aristocratic types of people. But he also suggests that along the way there came to be another type of ruling people or semi-ruling people who were the priestly aristocratic types. And here we need to think about the type of person who's not just a common peasant working in the field, nor a high-minded noble who is constantly training for war and dedicating himself to the higher things of life, good food and sex and all of that, but rather the type of person who becomes a monk or a priest who is concerned with purifying himself and takes certain negative attitudes towards his body, towards sexuality, toward food and drink, and lives in some cases a certain amount of a highly ascetic lifestyle, but then at the same time somehow is able to impose that lifestyle as an ideal. And since he or she is the one who claims to be living up to it, to have a certain amount of social power over the others. So the story gets more complicated. There is from the first something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies and in the habits ruling them, which turn them away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional explosions, habits which seem to have as their almost invariable consequence that intestinal morbidity and neurasthenia, which has afflicted priests at all times. So the suggestion here is maybe this is not some rude but healthy peasant working in the field, or some strong, vital noble going off to war, but there's a third type of person who's somewhat sickly inside physiologically, and that this poisons their mind in a certain direction, and their poisoned mind then generates rather a certain kind of moral code or a certain sort of valuation. So if we think, for example, certain forms of diet, people who say, oh, I'm not going to eat meat, and I'm only going to eat very sparingly, like a bird, and they become kind of skin and bones as a result of fasting. Oh, I'm not going to have sex. I'm going to keep myself pure. My sex is very shameful, and the whole thing is just kind of alien to me, and so forth. And rather than kind of embracing life and all of that, I'm going to flee away from life and go up into a mountain cave where I can be isolated, or go out into the desert or into the woods. So this entire anti-sensualistic metaphysics, where on earth could this possibly come from? And so this priestly type needs to be explained, and then how this priestly type, because we do know then that morality does come to be connected to a certain kind of theology with this anti-sensualistic metaphysics, and it becomes extraordinarily influential over the centuries. How on earth does this happen? So, one will have divined already how easily the priestly mode of valuation can branch off from the knightly aristocratic and develop into its opposite. And then what we have is a power struggle. The priests with their type of moral psychology and moral code, and the knights, the knightly warrior types with their type of psychology and their type of moral code, jockeying and fighting for power over the centuries and the millennia. And if we ask, well, what does this knightly aristocratic value judgment rest upon? Well, there's a kind of powerful physicality, a flourishing, abundant, even overflowing health, together with that which serves to preserve it. War, adventure, hunting, dancing, war games, and in general, all that involves vigorous, free, joyful activity. And there's a kind of person who just naturally wants to be that way. And some part of all of us thrills to, oh yeah, that's great, I want to have that kind of lifestyle. But then, of course, we have the opposite, the priestly valuation, which seems to be the complete opposite of everything. Right? This is a person who's not particularly physically healthy, particularly physically vital in any particular way. The idea of going off and physically embracing life in all of its dimensions does not at all seem attractive. Instead, the person seems to shrink from it. The priestly noble mode of valuation presupposes, as we have seen, other things. It's obviously disadvantaged when it comes to war. As is well known, priests are the most evil enemies. And there's that word evil again. But why? Because they are the most impotent. So suppose we imagine then someone who is kind of physically weak, does not have this vitality and kind of shrinks from all sorts of things, physicality, but nonetheless has a fairly active inner psychological life. What goes on in the mind of that kind of a person when they reflect on all of those other people out there enjoying life and going off to war and having sex and good drink and so on, and they're not doing that. At the same time, they don't want to evaluate themselves too negatively. They're still going to take themselves as basically good beings. And so what they then need to do is they have a conflict to be resolved. Their impotence combined with their psychological activity takes them in a certain direction. Because they are the most impotent, it is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions. The truly great haters in world history have always been priests. All right, a very strong claim. Now, historically, since it's the Judeo-Christian moral tradition that has come to dominate in the European context, and by context, by the modern context, rather, start to spread around the world. If we go back then to the origins of contemporary Judaism and contemporary Christianity, they of course have a long history. But if we go right back at the beginnings of this history, we find the Jews, and the question is going to be, this is Nietzsche's question, what kind of conditions did the Jews find themselves in such that they needed to come up with a certain kind of moral code? And the claim then is going to be that it was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency dared to invert the aristocratic value equation. Good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals beloved of God. So we take that and we're going to invert it and say the exact opposite is true. And to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, saying, the wretched alone are the good, not the flourishing. The ugly, the wretched alone are the good. The poor, impotent, lonely alone are the good. The suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are blessed by God. Blessedness is for them alone. And then you, the powerful and noble, on the contrary, are the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, etc., etc. So what we then have in this Jewish moral code is the exact opposite of that knightly, aristocratic moral code. And it's going to be the priests of Judaism, the rabbis and the others, who then are the ones who are most responsible for developing this inverted moral code and promulgating it culturally. And then he suggests we know, or one knows rather, who inherited this Jewish evaluation, and that, of course, is going to be Jesus and the Christians. So what he then claims is, as a historical point, is with the Jews there began the slave revolt in morality. And it's interesting that he calls it the slave morality, because he's hearkening back to the time when, according to Jewish history, the Jews were enslaved for many generations to the Egyptians. And so it's under those conditions, under those circumstances, where it's the Egyptians who are living the high life, and it's the Jews who are subjected to slavery. That is, under those circumstances, the Jews generated this inverted moral code. And it was obviously successful for them and has somehow spread. Next, this is very provocative, and Nietzsche is saying, he imagines his reader saying, what are you talking about? This is not possible. But you do not comprehend this. You're incapable of seeing something that required 2,000 years to achieve victory. So the idea here is that these different moral codes have been locked in a struggle over the course of not just generations, but thousands of years, and over the course of that thousands of years, one side has prevailed over the others, and it's just we're not even aware of it because, of course, most of us are born in a certain kind of culture. Now, Nietzsche then suggests it wasn't simply a survival tactic for the Jews under slavery with respect to the Egyptians that then became to be part of their psychological and cultural heritage, and they survived and were able to spread. And then the Christianity reformed it in a certain direction, and it spread right and so forth. It wasn't just a historical and cultural happenstance. Nietzsche suggests a darker story here, that this is in fact a kind of revenge. That is a kind of power play of the weak herd type slaves who are now former slaves type over those who are the master types and living the knightly aristocratic life. One should not imagine it grew up as the denial of that thirst for revenge, as the opposite of Jewish hatred. No, the reverse is true. That what we should do, Nietzsche is suggesting, is see moral codes as part of a strategy, a power politics, a cultural politics strategy that is used by a certain type of people to disarm those whom they see as their enemies and to take revenge on those whom they want to take revenge upon. Was it not part of the secret black art of truly grand politics of revenge? Okay, now I'm going to jump to section 10, where Nietzsche introduces the concept of ressentiment. It's kind of a French borrow word. And what he suggests is that there's a certain psychology here. It's close to resentment, and resentment is close to envy. But imagine all of that dark stuff that goes on inside you when you see other people doing better than you are, and whatever it is about you leads you to hate them for doing better than you are, and also to start hating yourself for not doing as well as they are. So there's a kind of sickly, ugly kind of psychology at work that goes on inside a certain kind of person. And what Nietzsche is going to say is, ressentiment is that psychology, but at a certain point it becomes creative and starts to generate a strategy, and as part of that strategy it generates a moral code. It becomes creative and gives birth to values. And he gives a psychological description here contrasting a certain kind of person, a healthy, noble, aristocratic type of person who lives in trust, handshake, I'm a man of my word, openness with himself, etc., etc. I'm of noble descent, upright, etc. By contrast, we know there's a type of person, the man of ressentiment, who's not upright, nor naive, nor honest, nor straightforward with himself. And then notice the words I've highlighted here. His soul squints. Right? Instead of looking you straight in the eye, we know there's a kind of squinty, sidelong glance type of person. His spirit loves hiding places, secret paths and back doors. Everything covert entices him as his world, his security. He knows how to keep silent, how never to forget. We know there are people who just hold on to grudges forever. They can't get it out of their system. They will be pretending to be self-deprecating and humble. And they will become cleverer, interestingly, Nietzsche suggests, than the other people. The knightly, aristocratic, noble type of person is much more physical, out there living in the world. The other person, the person of resentment, lives much more inside his own head, is kind of fearful of action, and so all of his time and his energy is devoted psychologically, and so he becomes psychologically more developed. So, jumping down, what we have then is a contrast between two types of moral codes. The bad of noble origin and the evil out of the cauldron of unsatisfied hatred. So what we then are going to have is two types of moral codes, and Nietzsche is going to give them different labels. The noble master type thinks in terms of good and bad. So it's just, I'm good, what I do, and the kind of world that I want is good. Everything that is the opposite of me, weak, more ordinary, pathetic, that's just the bad. By contrast, this other moral code thinks of itself as the good, the meek, the humble, the self-deprecating, the forgiving, and so forth. But then everything opposite to it is not just the bad, but the evil. And we know that evil has that additional rhetorical element, that additional nastiness, darkness associated to it. The noble person is more likely to say, oh, that's bad, but in a kind of dismissive, beneath contempt fashion. The person who wants to say, that's evil, right? They are really getting into the nastiness and wickedness of whatever it does. How different these words, Nietzsche goes on to say, bad and evil, are, although they are both apparently the opposite of the same concept, good. But it is not the same concept, good. We have two different conceptions of the good and two different conceptions of what their opposites are. Two different types of moral code in collision with each other. Now, I've highlighted this next paragraph here after some elision that Nietzsche is speaking largely from a European context, although he does mention the Indian Brahmins, and he's aware, particularly through Schopenhauer, of the influence of Buddhism on Western thought. But he wants to argue this is not a parochially European issue. He wants to point out that when we read history, we find examples of lots of cultures and lots of races in which this similar duality is at work. And so I just want to highlight this list here. The Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need. And so he gives those these examples of cultures that have generated their own noble class of being with their own noble or master type of morality. But the problem is, now jumping to our contemporary times, Nietzsche wants to say, we no longer have anything left to fear. We don't have people like those great noble races anymore. Instead, what we find in contemporary times is what he calls maggot man, swarming into the foreground, right? The kind of thing that comes out of rotten, nasty things and just kind of swarms in a distasteful fashion. We are tame. We are nice guys. We're just ordinary. We want to get along with our neighbors, etc. This hopelessly mediocre man. That is the kind of man that our contemporary moral codes are fostering and have made very widespread. And somehow they've overcome the potency of the noble aristocratic type of moral codes. And Nietzsche, there's some strong rhetoric in section 12 where he speaks kind of longingly, saying he doesn't want to give up on the battle yet, that he has the sense that he would like to see among his fellow human beings, not more ordinary nice guy maggot men. He wants to see those special individuals doing special things. Right? Grant me the sight, but one glance of something perfect, wholly achieved, happy, mighty, triumphant, something still capable of arousing fear. We don't want ordinary, boring existence where everything is safe and secure and we don't have to fear anybody. We want dangerous, exciting, powerful people doing risky, amazing things. That's the future for human beings that Nietzsche wants. And the danger he sees for European men right now is this idea of bringing human beings down, telling them not to be self-assertive, but rather to be more self-effacing, leveling, rather than saying some people are special and most people are not very admirable, in some cases most cases rather despicable. This idea that everybody is equal, leveling human beings. That, from Nietzsche's perspective, constitutes our greatest danger. The sight of him makes us weary. We just get bored. Oh man, this is not really working. Okay, jumping ahead now. Does some more interesting psychology in section 14. Would anyone like to take a look into the secret of how ideals are made on Earth? It's interesting that Nietzsche also has a reputation for being one of the founders or early progenitors of psychology as a discipline, for probing into psychology and its many workings, some of them rather dark workings. So what he asks us is to consider what will seem to be a fairly standard list of virtues from the Judeo-Christian tradition: humility, meekness, forgiveness, patience, and so on, and say, where do these things come from as virtues? Why on earth would we prize them? And we want to say, well, it's got to be from a certain kind of person, that a certain kind of person who is weak, who's unable, given his circumstances, to achieve what he really wants on the world, to go out and make a mark on the world, is going to manufacture his personal circumstances and his psychology and try to elevate those into virtues that everybody else is supposed to listen to. So suppose we are an impotent person. I am impotent. Well, at least he has a good heart. Suppose you're the kind of person who's anxious all of the time and you feel rather kind of lowly. Well, then you will manufacture that into humility. I'm a humble person, and you'll say that being humble is good. Being forced to be in subjection to those one hates, right? So one has to do what the boss says, or one has to do what the master says, and you're not weak enough, either of will or of physical power, to stand up and say, no, I'm going to do something different. You subject yourself to that person's will. Then you say, I have to be obedient, so I'm going to make obedience into a virtue. So I'm a certain kind of person and I'm good, and so therefore being a good guy, being humble, and being obedient, I'm going to project those as virtues for everyone. If I'm the kind of person who has to wait upon other people, and we know the kind of power plays that can go on, right? You show up for an appointment and the other person's in a position of power, they can make you wait around for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, right? Or whatever. You don't have the power to do anything about that. So if you are that kind of person who has to wait around for other people's biddings, well, then you'll say, I'm a patient person, and it's good to be a patient person. People do bad stuff to you. Of course, the natural thing, what a healthy person does, is takes revenge against the person who does something bad to you. But suppose, again, you're a weak person and you're not able to take revenge. Well, then you'll say, well, I'm not willing to take revenge. I don't want to take revenge. I'm beyond, above taking revenge. I'm a forgiving person, and I manufacture forgiveness into a virtue. So the point then is all of those virtues from Nietzsche's perspective are indications of a certain type of physical, psychological type, and it's a pathetic, weak type of physical, psychological type. And that is the origin of this competing moral code. He then goes on to argue that, that there's a kind of power play connecting up with this earlier theme about revenge. Or he does say, these people, someday or other, they too intend to be the strong. Right? There is no doubt of that. Someday their kingdom too shall come. And it's interesting, a little bit later, he goes on to quote St. Thomas Aquinas, who in the Catholic tradition, and also revered significantly in the Protestant tradition as well, writing 3 centuries before the Protestant Revolution broke out. But notice how Nietzsche quotes Thomas Aquinas here about their ultimate hopes. Yes, if I live a certain kind of person according to this Judeo-Christian moral code, the meek shall inherit the earth. Think of that. This will all be mine. Of course, I've got big, powerful God on my side, and he's going to take over the earth and turn it over to the likes of me, and we're going to go up to heaven. And when we get up to heaven, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be people like us, the weak and the meek and the suffering and the obedient, who get into heaven, and it's all of those rich, powerful people. They're going to be down in hell. And guess what? We're going to be able to see them down in hell, and won't that be nice? All right, what kind of psychology do we have at work here? So here's the quotation from Aquinas. He quotes him in Latin, but we'll do the English translation here. The blessed in the kingdom of heaven will see the punishments of the damned, in order that their bliss be more delightful for them. And then he goes on to quote Tertullian, an earlier church father, who had said much the same thing, but in longer and much more florid prose. Okay, reaching toward the end of this first essay, Nietzsche says, let us conclude the 2 opposing value frameworks, good and bad and good and evil, have been engaged in a fearful struggle on earth for thousands of years. And though the latter value has certainly been on top for a long time, there are still places where the struggle is as yet undecided. All right, so not quite as pessimistic. It seems like right now the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the slave morality, is winning, and it has been winning for quite a long time, particularly in the West. But there are still pockets where one can find the master morality still embodied in certain individuals. So it's not necessarily that the fight is over. The symbol of this great struggle, okay, there's a symbolic way of putting this. He's then saying, inscribed in letters legible across all history, is Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. And what he means by this is, if you take Rome, that great conqueror, master, where the Romans rose up, conquered not only their region in Italy, but then all of Italy, and then spread their empire to most of the known world, and they ruled, and they lived according to their own lights. They imposed their will on other people, on the world, and they made a go of it for many centuries. That's the master morality, and Nietzsche sees no more symbolic representation of it in all of history. That's Rome. By contrast, Judea, the birthplace of the 3 major Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam a little bit later, which is submission, falling on your knees, feeling sinful, feeling weak, withdrawing from the world, hoping that some other powerful force will come along and save the day for you. Those 2 completely different moral codes in collision with each other, the Roman one, the Judeo-Christian one, the master morality, the slave morality, in conflict, And right now, unfortunately, from Nietzsche's perspective, it is the Judeo-Christian slave morality that is winning. And he has an interesting, another further symbolic point that he raises a couple of paragraphs later. Well, which one of them has won for the present, Rome or Judea? But there can be no doubt. Consider to whom one bows down in Rome itself today. And of course, Rome now is where the Vatican is, and the Vatican is the seat of the Roman Catholic Church. And so the point Nietzsche is suggesting symbolically is ultimately the Judeo-Christian tradition won. It defeated Rome, and not only did it defeat Rome, it moved its capital to Rome, and the chief of the slave morality is currently reigning in Rome, and he's the person to whom one bows down. This is very remarkable. Rome has been defeated beyond all doubt. Now, some indications across history that the battle is ongoing. During the Renaissance, a rise again of the noble, the aristocratic, the vigorous, the life-loving, the nature-affirming morality, followed shortly thereafter by a return of the Judeo-Christian, in particularly vigorous form, the Reformation, the French Revolution, triumph once again of slave morality or Judeo and so on. But things do go on. But then even out of the French Revolution, we have a figure like Napoleon, another master type who rises up and imposes his will basically on all of Europe. So what of the future? This final section from the first essay in Genealogy of Morals. Was that the end of it? Is the battle over? Have we reached, so to speak, the end of history? Or, and Nietzsche is putting this out just as a hopeful suggestion, must the ancient fire, right, that fire in the belly, that fire inside, must the ancient fire not someday flare up much more terribly? Right? So there's still hope for the human beings. And then he suggests for us, for you, for people who are reading his words, we're the intended audience here, whoever begins at this point, like my readers. So what Nietzsche is wanting is that we will become more aware given his diagnosis, and we will be hopefully less likely to fall for the snares and the traps of the wrong morality. We'll find some way of channeling our inner potential for master morality and do something to bring credit to the human species.